One of the hardest things to master in the deadlift is the slack pull. And much like bench press with leg drive, how many people have been lifting for years and are still working on being able to master the ability to leg drive, almost like it's an art form, to improve their tension and stability in the bench press. The same goes for deadlift. Many people who've been powerlifting for years still really truly don't know how to really get tension out of the bar and pull slack before their lift. With the slack pull, we're really trying to achieve four main things. We're trying to improve our starting tension, improve our starting position, take the slack out of the bar in the sense of if you look at the bar, people, if you've heard about slack pull before, and I'm sure if you're watching this video you have, you hear about people you talk about hearing that click, which is basically taking, reducing that little bit of range and gap between the bar or the collar and the plates. We're trying to do that so we're actually, in a sense, loading the bar and the plates correctly. And then lastly, and I think maybe underspoken a lot, is we're trying to decrease range of motion. We do all these things to decrease range of motion. We have 18 pairs of deadlift slippers that are as slow as they can to the floor, but we still don't know how to slack pull. So that's really trying to, in a sense, improve our starting height by raising that up, by getting the most slack possible out of the bar, so that we're actually starting the highest, decreasing range of motion, and making our pull as efficient as possible. What this video is going to cover is what I've kind of determined is the 5 best techniques to pull slack. And if you're looking across the spectrum of lifters, all the best deadlifters, the best at pulling slack, you can pretty much take all of those lifters and in some manner, they're going to be one of these 5 techniques. Even though they might differ a little bit because everyone's a little bit individual with how they set up for their deadlift, we can kind of clump them together in one of these 5 techniques is kind of, this is the foundation of their technique. And then they might make little individual characteristics based off of that. So we're going to go through each one of those techniques to really break those down on how to master those. But first, we really need to understand the foundational principles of the deadlift and the slack pull before we even then get into those techniques. So if you haven't already watched my video of optimizing your deadlift setup for a strong lockout, really, like, even though the title kind of entails looking at how to optimize your setup for a strong lockout, that applies to every deadlift ever. Our goal is, in a sense, to improve our position off the floor, to be the strongest possible at lockout, so we're not getting into this kind of like uncurling pattern of our low back. So a lot of these foundational principles I'm going to talk about right now and kind of skim through, I really cover in that video. I think that video is over an hour long and I really break down everything. So a lot of things that are going to precede this video, in the sense that I'm going to already assume the understanding, are in that video. So if you haven't watched that, I'd also recommend giving that a watch as well. So some of these things will make sense a little bit more, as I'm not going to cover every aspect of the deadlift setup. We're just going to skip forward to how we slack pull. With that, there's some foundational principles, just like most of my videos you see. There's things that, like, even if we adjust our technique on deadlift, or we choose one of these 5 different techniques I'm going to talk about, there's a foundational principle to all 5 of these techniques that apply. And the first one, with conventional deadlift, there is a hip hinge and some form of knee flexion involved in the lift. There's no way around that. A deadlift primarily is a hip hinge based movement, but also within the conventional deadlift, we have some type of knee flexion. That's where we're loading those posterior and anterior muscles in some manner to become the most efficient possible, by finding the right kind of tension distribution between those. On the sumo deadlift, we have the hip hinge, but it's a little less. I mean, that's why people sumo deadlift, because we get a little less of a hinge and we get to be a little bit more knee flexion dominant. But there's also an abduction aspect and kind of external rotation of those femurs that are involved too, because obviously we are wider. So when we're going through this slack pull, a lot of the things we need to think about is the movement of these joints. With conventional, we're going to have some type of movement at the hips and the knees. And then with sumo, we're going to have some type of movement at the hips, knees, and then with some type of movement within the hip with ER and the abduction of our femurs. The next foundational element of the deadlift and slack pull is we must have the equal and opposite reaction, just like we have in every lift. We must have vertical tension going up, and that's primarily going from the bar, pulling slack through our arms and through our mid and upper back. That's creating this upward vertical tension so that then we can have downward force through our midfoot. And one of the biggest keys there, and I'll talk about throughout all of this, is, at least in the sense of the deadlift, we need to kind of cue and think that vertical tension precedes downward force. If we don't have that vertical tension going up by creating that pulling of the slack, we're gonna have a really hard time creating downward force. You can't push your feet into the floor outside of just gravitational force if you don't have something to leverage against that. And you've heard that, to leverage, to wedge, any of those kind of terms when it comes to slack pull. That's exactly what we're doing. And while in the truest manner, both are happening at the same time. We really can't precede one before the other. The cueing though, I will say, we're trying to think vertical tension first to then create that force downward through our feet. Next up in the foundational elements is our foot rooting and our foot position. That's something I talk a little bit more in 2 different videos, which I'll link all of these below. In my optimizing the deadlift setup, I talk a little bit about foot position, as well in my foot rooting video, even though it's talking a little bit more about the squat, all the same things apply to the deadlift. It's just the deadlift's a little bit easier with that. So our foot position is going to dictate a lot of what comes up through the chain. So if we are over supinated or over pronated, both of those are going to cause issues up the chain when it comes to our femur position and hip position and all those things that kind of then affect our ability to pull slack. So these are all things that, like I said, I'm not going to cover in detail in this video. I cover that more in the deadlift, but they're the foundational elements that if we don't have these right, what I'm going to mention is not going to probably work well for you. So we have to master these things before you're able to master these 5 techniques I'm going to talk about with slack pull. And then the last foundational principle I'll kind of go through, and I've kind of already alluded to this, is having the correct distribution of posterior to anterior tension of the primary movers of the deadlift. I would say in regards to looking at the 5 techniques, as you'll kind of see, for the most part, we're going to tend to bias to first loading the posterior muscles because in essence, this is a hinge-based movement. It is more posterior dominant, where a squat is more anterior dominant. Even though we can't neglect the fact that the glutes and the hamstrings are working in the squat, they're probably working a bit more in the deadlift since we are going through a more hip flexion-based movement and needing more of our posterior muscles through that lengthening and shortening cycle to be able to achieve a deadlift from the floor to lockout. So going back to what I kind of mentioned, most of these slack pull techniques are first going to load the posterior muscles, and which you kind of can picture is a lot of times people's hips are higher, they kind of brace at that position, and then they pull in and wedge. Well, that when those hips are higher, we're in a sense loading those posterior muscles, and then as we pull in, we're maintaining that tension as we then shift our position to also load those anterior muscles. So a lot of this is to find that correct distribution, but also to break that up. It's kind of hard to load both at the same time and kind of think about that. So it's a little bit easier to be able to kind of focus on the loading and tensioning of the posterior chain first, and then working our way into that anterior muscle tensioning of the quads and the adductors to be able to get them into the right position to do their role within the deadlift. So those are the foundational principles that I kind of want to cover in the sense of what we need to precede the ability to master the slack pull. So now let's just get into it. We're going to have 5 different ways that I'm going to show of how I see most people pulling slack and kind of the best techniques that I've come across and that I think most of the best lifters can fall into. And then what we'll do, per usual in a lot of my videos, I'm going to take examples of my lifters who are very proficient in slack pulling in each one of these techniques and really break it down. So because the fact of the matter is you're going to see as I do this, I am not a good conventional puller. I don't have the ability to get in that position very well, so a lot of times when I demonstrate that, it doesn't look the best. So even though I'll be able to kind of relay the thought process and the cueing with it, I always like to give these breakdowns of my lifters, conventional and sumo, so I can really show you kind of how that plays out with the most efficient pullers and kind of how they do this and put it into practice. All right, so let's get into the 5 best techniques to pull slack and really master your deadlift setup. So a couple things I want to proceed with this is one thing, you probably heard this cue before, is that we kind of want, like, let's say there was 600 pounds in the bar. We in sense want to pull like 400 pounds of slack out. That's just a random number thrown out. But you look at, if you watch, I mean, Garrett Fear has posted this before. If you've seen Garrett Fear do it, up to like 500 pounds, the bar is literally coming up off the floor before he even deadlifts. So that's a bit of an extreme example. Not everyone's going to pull that much, but our goal is to really kind of get a good deal of that weight in our hands. And you're going to see, I'm using a deadlift bar just for example purposes, just because it's going to be a little bit easier for you just through video to be able to see that slack being pulled, especially when I'm only using 225 pounds. But you're going to see with 225 pounds, I'm going to be able to pull slack out of that bar. And I see some people using a deadlift bar that at 500 pounds, they're not even getting much out of it. So if you do it right, you can get a lot out of it, even with lighter weight. So the first technique we're going to go over is what I'll call the RDL slack pull. I'm going to demonstrate that now very soon. We can see this with both conventional and sumo pullers, but if I would say looking at the spectrum, this is probably a little bit more popular for conventional pullers, and you'll kind of see why. As with sumos, there's a little bit more intricacy with the setup and that hip abduction, external rotation. Sometimes this doesn't really satisfy the initial ability for someone to kind of feel the position they need to be in. But for conventional, this is probably a very widely used one, if not the most widely used one. So let's start with conventional. Probably for most of these, I'm going to start showing with conventional, then show sumo, just for demonstration purposes to keep it consistent. So with conventional deadlift, what I mean by the RDL setup. So again, like I said, I'm not going to go through what is a hinge and how to RDL. If you really need help on that, definitely make sure to check out that last deadlift video I put out. But what I mean by this is we never really get into a deadlift position. We more go through a hip hinge pattern to an RDL, and where I'm still kind of in this like stiff leg Romanian deadlift style. From there, I'm going to grab the bar with a neutral back. That's one of the biggest keys here, is that way too many people, when they go to do something like this, they reach down for the bar and they lose their position. We don't want to necessarily reach for and grab the bar. We want the bar more to come to us through our positions. You can see here, I RDL. From there, I still can't reach the bar, so I just hinge a little bit more, I can grab onto it. And then from there, my biggest key is to leverage my upper back up through my traps, through my arms, through my upper traps. And really what I'm almost doing is trying to go through this hip extension to create this tension to the back of my hamstrings, my glutes, and my low back. Like I said in the foundational principles, we're trying to load our posterior chain to get that tension properly and get slack out of the bar before then pulling in and tensioning our anterior muscles. So we hinge, we grab the bar with that neutral back position, we start to already leverage up with our upper back, and I'm already pulling slack out of the bar, and then all we have to do is bend the knees and we're in position. And hold on to that slack as I, in a sense, rotate to the fulcrum of my shoulders. My shoulders already have this tension and this vertical tension going from the bar through my arms, through my shoulders, and through my traps up to the ceiling, and I'm just rotating through that fulcrum and bringing my shins to the bar. And that's a big key as well that goes with all of these that we're going to talk about a little bit more. So I'm going to go through the do's and don'ts of slack pulling and some things not to do. One thing not to do is don't pull your hips into the bar. I'm going to explain that a little bit further. So, RDL. Grab the bar, leverage up to get that slack, pull in, and deadlift. So with sumo, the same thing applies, just a little bit different, because we got to kind of think about that hip abduction as well. So when we get in position, we're probably going to start out with a little bit more of a RDL and external rotation hip abduction to kind of get in position. So I'm going to drive my knees out a little bit, hinge. I can't get to the bar, so from there, I'm going to RDL down to it. So you can see here, RDL, a lot of tension. I already feel my hamstrings, my glutes tensioning, and now I'm directly over the bar. And again, remember, we can't reach down to the bar, because when we reach down to the bar, we then round our back, and our hips, the effective distance of our hips to where we should be is too short. That's why we have to round. Our hips are too close. We have to have this hinge pattern to create room for our shoulder blades to be directly over the bar and have this neutral back position as we tension. Or else then, we're just tensioning through this rounded back. So, knees out, hinge. I'm in this kind of sumo RDL position. I'm going to grab the bar. I'm going to leverage my chest and shoulders up towards the ceiling. And then my knees come out, chest comes up, and I'm in position. All right, the next technique I call the rise slack pull. And just like I said, the RDL slack pull is probably a little bit more biased towards conventional pullers. The rise slack pull is probably what you'll see the vast majority of sumo pullers using. Again, guys, you'll see a spectrum of all lifters throughout these 5 techniques, but if there's one that probably applies to the majority of sumo pullers, it's this one. Works for conventional as well, but it definitely seems to be the go-to option for most sumo pullers. So let's go into it. So the biggest difference between this and the RDL is we're going to get a little bit more into a deadlift position before we then pull slack. Like I said, with the RDL, we never really got into position. We just went into this hip hinge pattern and then loaded posterior muscles and then got into place. So with the more rise slack pull, we're going to have that same hinge pattern. But then I'm gonna drop down to the bar a little bit more. I'm not in the perfect deadlift position right now. I wouldn't want to pull from this position, but it's a little bit closer to my normal pull. From there, what's gonna happen is I'm going to allow my body as a whole to rise. And the biggest issue that people get wrong on this one, and this is probably the most popular version for a lot of people to do wrong, is they just let their hips rise up. They get in this position, their hips come up, their hips come down, and never once do they pull any slack because they forgot that their body as a whole needs to rise, not just their hips. So what I mean by the body as a whole is I'm going to kind of get in position, I'm going to grab the bar, and then my hip to my shoulders, my back in general, I think about the safe back position, is going to rise up towards the ceiling together. Getting my hips rise a little faster, but everything's rising together to get that tension before then pulling in. I'm getting to that same RDL position. Some people just like a little bit more to be able to kind of feel that slight starting position a bit more before then rising up. But the big key, like I said, the hips don't just rise. Everything rises together as you go through it. And the same thing goes for that sumo deadlift. We're going to be in position, kind of knees out, hips hinge. We're going to allow those hips to move back so we can grab the bar, but unlike the last one, I'm not really keeping my legs straight. I'm still allowing them to continue to kind of, in a sense, flex and abduct as I hinge to get to the bar. But from there, I'm now going to allow my entire body to rise up. And you can see there, my legs straighten a little bit as my hips rise, but also my upper back is rising with to get that slack and hold that slack so then I can rotate on that fulcrum on my shoulders to then pull. All right, next up is what I'll call the deadlift position to hip rise slack pull. And what this is kind of like, if someone really struggles with the previous two and they always just end up not being able to get positioning properly, which I'm gonna cover more of probably the don'ts of why that's happening later on, is we can first pretty much do this static tension deadlift to get slack, hold that position before then we rise the hips to then pull back in, because obviously a deadlift is a concentric only movement. We don't have eccentric loading. And the reason we like to, in a sense, let our hips kind of pull in is it gives this sense of eccentric loading that we don't get otherwise. So I'm gonna cover actually the next one, how maybe we don't even do some type of hip rise, but at least with this one, we're able to kind of feel the deadlift position to know the position we need to be in, maintain that while we then rise the hips, and then pull back in to kind of get that feeling of eccentric loading. So what I mean by that is, again, the RDL, all we did was a hinge and then grab the bar. The rise version, we did a hinge, we almost got in position, but not fully, and then we rose and pulled slack before we then anchored in. So on this variation, we're gonna get into our deadlift position like we're going to deadlift. So I'm going to hinge, I'm going to grab the bar, I'm going to already be in position, I'm going to start pulling slack out, then raise my hips up while holding that to then pull back in. I was able to establish my actual starting position on the deadlift, tension that before then using again that shoulder position and that joint as a fulcrum to then move around as the hips move up to where I kind of then bias forward those posterior muscles tensioning to then before pull back in and kind of in a sense eccentrically load and pull myself into the floor to create that downward force preceded by that vertical tension. You'll notice, again, I said foundational things, is that every single time here we've thought about first creating some type of vertical tension before then wedging and anchoring in our lower body under us to create that downward force. So what this would look like for sumo, so similar thing, is just like the RDL version, I'm going to let my knees come out. RDL, I would then do kind of that all hinge pattern. The rise version, I would do a little bit of the hinge pattern, but keep my knees a little bit more flexed, grab the bar. With this version, I'm gonna really get in position. So I'm gonna let those knees drive out. I'm going to hinge, kind of wedge myself in there where I'm in my starting position. I'm going to rise up my body as a whole, because I'm trying in a sense to already start my deadlift to get a certain amount of that bar weight in my hands and tension. So I'm going to, in a sense, rise up, then I'm gonna raise my hips, then I'm gonna pull in and deadlift. The next one I've kind of already alluded to when I talked about the kind of deadlift slack pull to hip rise is just the straight static slack pull, where we never even do a hip rise. We kind of just, in a sense, get into position, we start pulling slack and tensioning, kind of pause there for a second so we can kind of feel that, and then go into our lift. You can almost kind of think of it as like if we're going 0 to 100, we go 0 to 30, pause there for a second to establish that tension in position, and then go 30 to 100. I mean, just name dropping people who do this is if you look at Trevor Jaffe, he's actually switched to this. And the main reason to switch to this is because anytime we do any one of these other techniques, there's room for error. If we make just slight incremental errors in the sense of our positioning as we pull in, it gets us out of position, it can move the bar, it can change how we wedge, all these things could possibly in a sense go wrong. And in a sense that static position, it seems to not, we can kind of eliminate that variable. With that, you rarely see conventional pullers do this variation. And that's partially because with the slack pull, I don't want to say conventional is easier per se, but conventional is less complicated. There's just less movement going on because we don't have that abduction and ER happening with the femurs. It's a little less complicated, so we can get away with maybe not the perfect slack pull, which you see a lot of conventional deadlifters almost kind of doing this jerk style and being efficient with it. Where sumo, it's harder to get away with that. So you'll rarely, I'm going to show it, but you'll rarely see conventional pullers do this. This is more something you'll see a lot of sumo pullers doing. And while maybe it takes a little bit off of your top end strength because you can't do this kind of this makeshift eccentric loading, if you can now actually show your top end strength and display that without form breakdown, there's a benefit to that. Maybe it takes off 5 kilos off your top end strength, but now you can always show those 5 kilos. So it's probably not the most popular version of the slack pull, but it can definitely work. So taking a look at it with conventional, like I said, this is pretty simple. We're just gonna get into our deadlift position just like we did with the deadlift slack pull to the hip rise. But from there, we're just going to kind of tension and then lift. So I'm going to approach the bar, I'm going to grab it, I'm going to get in position, I'm going to start to rise, feel that tension, and then pull. The big difference there, some people kind of do that, but they don't establish the tension. They just kind of get in position and then they jerk it. They don't establish that 0 to 30 first, maintain that, then go 30 to 100. And so again, same thing with sumo deadlift. We're going to establish position. We're going to get here, okay, I'm going to get about 30%. I'm going to wedge and make sure I'm in good position. And lift up. So that one seems fairly simple. It looks like a lot less to do with it, and that's the whole point of it, is we're kind of simplifying the process. We're not able to kind of get that eccentric loading in through that kind of wedge and then kind of that hip shoot coming down, but we're still able to make sure we manage the correct position, tension it, and then maintain that as we pull. The last one I'll coin as rising as you pull in, and this is probably the one I'd least recommend. There's just a lot more that can go wrong, and it's probably also the least popular, but some people are very effective with it. And basically what it entails is you're gonna do really one of those techniques I showed, really the first three, the RDL to a slack pull, the hip rise, or the rise to a slack pull, as well as kind of the deadlift slack pull to a hip rise. Any one of those can be kind of done with this to an extent, but really what it is you're not really gonna pull much slack until you start anchoring in. And it can work, but it's just a little bit dangerous because we are trying as we pull in to then cue this anchoring effect and the slack pull, and things can just go wrong with it, but it can work. And that's why I want to show it, because there definitely are some very proficient sumo deadlifters that do a really good job of this technique. So I think it's worth mentioning because it can be a very valid technique for some people. So what I mean by this is, and I typically say too, this is more of a conventional technique. We'll see a lot more conventional pullers do this than sumo, because sumo relies a lot more, I should say a lot more, but it definitely relies more on an efficient starting position, where we can get away with improper starting position on conventional sometimes. But what I mean by this is, we'll just do the kind of like the RDL version. Is I'm going to get into the RDL, I'm going to grab the bar. I never really have slack out. But as I go to pull, I'm going to, in a sense, try and rise my shoulders up as then my knees bend and my shins come to the bar and I pull my feet in the floor. And that's where I'm pulling the slack. I'm not really pre-pulling slack. There's no slack pulled out in the beginning. It's happening as I pull in. So what that looks like is no slack right here. And then as I pull in, I'm going to leverage up. You can see as I do that, the bar starts to kind of come off the floor. And that happens even too with people who are doing the other versions, but even so more with this, that's what we're kind of trying to do, is we're going from no slack to almost kind of trying to wedge the bar off the floor as I pull. And that's why it's kind of hard with this one, is it's harder to determine and control how much slack you're pulling. It kind of just happens. The other ones you saw, I could, just with 225, I could get slack, but not let the bar leave the floor. And since come competition time, we don't want the bar leaving the floor like that. We want to wedge and then produce our force. So with this one, it's a little bit harder to control that. But like I said, you're going into that kind of RDL position, no slack, but then as I go to pull in, I'm going to leverage my chest up to then pull. Same thing with sumo. Like I said, sumo is a little bit less common to see this done with. You'll see this kind of, but it's more so that they have some slack already, and then they really increase the amount of slack they get as they pull in. So we're going to get in position, we're going to hinge, I'm going to kind of allow myself to rise, but no slack is pulled out yet. That bar is completely loose. And so from there, as I then pull in, I'm going to leverage that chest up and rise those shoulders to then pull in. So, like I said, it can be very effective. I just find it to be a more advanced technique and a bit harder to control. And it's kind of like someone who's trying to adjust leg drive throughout the movement on bench press. It's a bit easier to just have this consistent leg drive than trying to adjust it throughout the bench press, because things can just go wrong from that. So it's to each their own kind of technique of what they think works best for them, but this definitely can be a technique that works for a lot of advanced lifters. So now that we've covered what I consider the 5 best and most prominent slack pull techniques of the most proficient and advanced deadlifters, let's really get into kind of like the intricacies of the do's and don'ts. So what I'm going to do for each one of these is we're going to first cover what not to do and the common error we're seeing, and then what we should do instead. So first up for good reason, is that it arguably could be the biggest mistake most people make on the deadlift, is over tucking their hips. So what they're doing, sumo's probably even more obvious, is how many people go to pull in and then they tuck their hips under, they get in this posterior tilt, they get to this position here, their glutes and their hamstrings are fully contracted, and then they have to do this uncurl pattern. Definitely happens on conventional as well, where we get to this kind of this pull the hips under. They're closer to the bar in a sense, like what we think we should do, but it's also not what we should do, and I'll explain a little bit further. So what we should do is get the hips as close to the bar as possible, in a sense without ever thinking about getting the hips close to the bar. So that might not make sense at first, but hip position is dictated by everything else. Never once when I cue a deadlift am I thinking about what my hips are doing. The hips are the result of the other foundational patterns. As I mentioned, for conventional, we have a hip hinge and we have knee flexion. With the sumo deadlift, we have a hip hinge, knee flexion, and a hip like ER/abduction. Those determine your hip height and where your hips lie. Based on your general anatomy, your hips have to be a certain effective distance away from the bar. If we get them any closer, that's where we have this posterior rotation, this low back rounding, and we're getting them too close for your general anatomy. If our shoulders are going to be over the bar and our back is going to be neutral, the hips have to be a certain distance away from the bar to allow that. And that's why a lot of times, like I talk about, when we do kind of the RDL pattern and the hinge pattern, which I really talk about in the optimizing your deadlift setup video, we have to make sure to make room for the hips. Way too many people, I'm going to get to this in a little bit, just reach down for the bar, lay around their back. We have to create the effective distance for the hips to be able to hinge and satisfy the shoulders being over the bar. So what I mean by letting everything else dictate it, if I am conventional deadlifting, I'm going through a hinge, and let's go through the RDL pattern slack pull. I'm going through a hinge, slack pulling up, and then from there, I never once think about pulling my hips towards the bar. I just need to allow my knees to bend as I leverage my chest, my shoulders, and my upper back up. There's no part where I need to posteriorly rotate my pelvis. I'm just doing what I need to by manipulating my hip hinge and my knee flexion to create that vertical force while pulling my feet into the floor. So what I mean by that, I'm creating tension, I then leverage my chest up while my knees bend, and then I deadlift. Never once did I actually, at this point here, my hip flexion degree never changed. It stays the same. All I'm doing now is satisfying the knee flexion demands by bending those to get into position. And the same thing for sumo deadlift. If I'm going through, let's go through the hip rise variation. So my knees are going out. I never once thought about my hips getting close to the bar. The knees just went out, and naturally from that, the hips are going to get close to the bar. Then if I tilt my knees go forward and don't create this abduction external rotation. Then from there, I do need to create a little bit more of a hinge because I can't grab the bar yet. So I'm going to hinge. I'm going to allow myself to rise up, and then from there, I have my hip flexion set. I just need maybe a little bit more knee flexion and a little bit more abduction and external rotation to then get to the bar position. So I let myself rise up, my chest leverages up as my knees drive out and forward, and I'm in position to then pull. Never once through that did I ever think, where should my hips be? That hip height was just determined by everything else. The next do and don't, and probably what I put the second, because I probably consider it the second biggest issue I see on most people with deadlift, is driving their knees too far forward. This is a hinge-based pattern, and as well as the bar is in a specific position when we start up to be over our midfoot and center of gravity. So anytime we change that bar position by driving our knees and knocking that bar forward, which you see so often, someone deadlift, they drive it forward, they push that out, and now that's getting to in front of our center of gravity, changing the weight distribution and tensioning of the dominant muscles within the primary movers, and now we're just knocked ourselves out of the position we want to be. So what you should do is use the barbell as a stopper. The barbell should never move. The barbell isn't contorting and deciding what, like, it doesn't have a brain to decide what it should do. You are, in a sense, need to be contorting around the barbell. So the barbell position is dictated during your setup. Wherever you set up with your, getting that bar over your midfoot or wherever it's best suited for you, that bar should never move from that position. You then move around the barbell. So as I go into my conventional deadlift, I tension up, my knees bend as I leverage my chest up and pull my feet to the floor. And as soon as my shins touch that barbell, that's where I should pull. If I go any farther forward, I'm now getting out of position. And the same thing goes for sumo, except it's a little bit different. With sumo, we don't want to just directly drive our knees forward. We need to drive them, in a sense, most likely with our foot position. So when we're in this more externally rotated and abducted position, those knees have to go out, not just forward. And that's a big mistake sumo pullers make, and it usually coincides with the hip tuck, is everything just drives forward in the bar versus opening up to the bar. So when we're going into sumo, we're really trying to think about, we got that tension, and then from there, the knees don't drive forward, they drive out to the bar, and as soon as that touches that bar, that's my position. Everything's been dictated by that bar position to start, and if that bar position to start is off, we may sink too low. We may not be able to sink low enough, but that's not the bar's fault. That's our initial setup's fault. We need to then change bar position, not then try and change bar position in the middle of our deadlift by kicking it out. The next one is don't overly thoracically flex. And I'm going to get into, we'll also lump in mid-back or low-back flexion as well, but that's the more obvious one. The one that's been popular lately is people trying, the best lifters look like they're thoracically flexing, but what you don't realize is there's not much thoracic flexion. It's just protraction and this wrapping of the shoulder blades around, which creates this look that they're thoracically flexing, but really the spine angle is staying neutral. So we need to understand that. So what we don't want to do, and I'm going to link a couple of articles I've written in the description box below that probably cover some of the things I'm talking about, but one in particular I talked about how, especially with sumo deadlift in particular, too many people try and tension through their low back versus their upper traps. And what I mean by that is they'll get in position, everything looks pretty good, but then they'll go to tension up and do this rise, and they'll tension through that mid-back, and they get into this position, and then they go to pull. You don't want to be having to adjust your back position as you pull in and wedge. That's gonna then change your effective distance of the shoulders to the hips, and then change your tensioning. And what you see a lot with a lot of people that do this is they look like they get really good slack, but as soon as they pull in, they start to lower themselves because they then have to change and adjust that thoracic position to get into place. And like I said, that goes with mid-back or low-back too. What we want to do is when we do this slack pull, with every technique I talked about, we should be tensioning with a neutral spine angle. We want to tension with the exact angle of the spine that we want to lift with. I'm not saying that the back can't flex at all once we start lifting, but we don't really want to start with a flex back. We want to start with a neutral back. So what that means is we need to tension more through the arms, through the upper traps, as well as making sure we have room, I've discussed multiple times, to be able to do that. If we don't allow enough room with the hips to be able to grab the bar over our shoulder blades, either one, I'm going to start rounded, or two, I'm going to start out over the bar. So I need to make enough room to be able to grab the bar neutral so that when I then tension, I can do so with this neutral back position. And then same thing with sumo deadlift. We need to make sure we have enough room, and then as I tension, I'm tensioning through the arms to the upper trap and making sure I'm not allowing those hips and the mid-back to rise. I'm allowing those upper traps and shoulders to rise too as I tension the bar. And like I said, thoracic flexion and protraction are not the same thing. This is thoracic flexion and protraction. This is just protraction. Now it's going to look like I have a slight round in my upper back because that's the natural curve of your back. Your back isn't straight, it has an S curve to it. So naturally, we have a slight curve. So when we protract, that's a lot more obvious, and now it's not covered up by our traps and rhomboids and all those big back muscles. So the best lifters don't do that. The issue is that these beginners and intermediates see this and they think, oh, they're allowing this thoracic flexion. I should do that too and allow this rounding to, in a sense, decrease range of motion. That's not what they're doing. What they're allowing themselves to do is be able to open up those shoulder blades to be able to create the longest arm position as possible. A way you kind of cue this or think about this, kudos to Sean Collins at Barbells and Cats on Instagram. He had a really good video on this. He thought about basically pulling your collarbone as furthest away from the bar as possible. We're not trying to, in a sense, pull our mid-back as far away from the bar as possible. We're trying to pull our collarbone. That's creating this thoracically neutral position while allowing our shoulders to protract and reach away to create this long arm position. Next up is don't just grab the bar. And I've already mentioned this multiple times because it fits with so many of these other mistakes that people make, is that way too often as we're setting up, we just go down and reach for the bar. And we get in this bad position that then we're having to somehow try to fix as we then pull in and wedge. And we don't want to do that. There's no rule in powerlifting that like you get a start command before you grab the bar. Like it's not start, oh I gotta rush. Lift. No, your setup can take, in a sense, as much time within that 1 minute, but most people aren't gonna have a 1 minute setup unless you're getting ridiculous. Most people, take your time. Your setup is dictating everything else. Unlike the squat and the bench press, we don't have any eccentric loading. The setup, in the sense of a squat and a bench press for the press or coming up out of a squat is the eccentric. We have that ability to control this eccentric motion to then load the concentric to come back up. We don't have that on a deadlift. That's our setup. That's what we're trying to do there. So we need to be patient with that to make the best setup possible. So don't reach for the bar. What you should do, as I've already alluded to, is kind of let the bar come to you. Let your position changes then get you to the bar. So that's gonna be different for everyone. Obviously, if you have super long arms and gate leverages, it would be, if you're Yuri Belkin, all you pretty much have to do is drive your knees out, hinge a little bit, and then boom, the bar's right there. For me and most people watching, that's not the case. We have to change our positional requirements and position with the knee flexion and hip hinge and with sumo, the ER and abduction to be able to then be able to get our position where our hips are in the effective right place due to all those other joint changes manipulating our body correctly to be the most advantageous possible. So in the sense of sumo, as I mentioned in a lot of this in my deadlift setup video, we're trying to then create this position where we can grab the bar. And you can see here, one of the biggest things I'm trying to do when I grab the bar is I'm not squatting down to the bar. I'm opening up, and I've created that abduction and external rotation as much as I can. From there, I need to hinge. If there's one thing that we take away from this specific point is you have to hinge in the deadlift. There's no other way around it. It is a hinge-based movement. And way too many people try and grab the bar without satisfying the hinge requirement prior. And so what that looks like on a conventional deadlift, we have to hinge to be able to grab the bar, not reach down and grab it and then try to work our way into a hinge. On a conventional deadlift, or a sumo deadlift, knees out, and then we can't just reach down and grab the bar because either one, we're gonna round the back, or two, we're gonna end up squatting down. We then have to hinge and create this effect that our torso is one rigid unit that has to move together. So to get my shoulder blades over the bar and be able to reach it, my rib cage has to move towards my hips so that I hinge. The hips in sense go back a little bit. I can now reach the bar, go to grab it, and then I can get into position. I never once tried to grab the bar. I just manipulated my leverages and joint angles to be able to then be able to get to the point where I could satisfy the requirements to grab the bar with the correct positions. The next one is don't overly leverage back onto your heels. There's a lot of people, when I'm talking about these 5 techniques and how to master slack pull, they get everything right until they then go to pull in and they just create this like leverage back position. Now, the bar is in front of us, so there is this kind of slight forward bias in the weight distribution, so we are slightly behind it, but it's not by much, not nearly as some people do. Like a lot of times you see old school videos, if you're not like people used to teach it, okay, you're gonna deadlift, you're gonna sit back on your heels, you're gonna let go, you're gonna be flying back. While that's true to an extent, it's not to that extent. We don't want to then rotate our center of gravity back. We're just trying to create this vertical force while this other force vertically goes down to create this equal and opposite reaction. And those are trying to be as close to each other as possible. If we leverage back, we then separate those and then, in a sense, adjust our center of gravity outside the proper tension distribution. So what we should do is think a lot more of those lines being very close together with that vertical force and that downward force. We're trying to pull our midfoot into the floor. And just like if you know much about me with squats, I really like barefoot squatting. I also like barefoot deadlifting. Barefoot deadlifting is probably a bit more common than squatting, but I mean, if you have an issue with leveraging back onto your heels, take your shoes off and you'll find very quickly that hurts a lot. That cushion in the shoe helps a lot so it's not uncomfortable. If you go try and overly leverage back without your shoes on, you're going to immediately feel how uncomfortable it is, and you're probably going to do a much better job of when you then slack pull and then pull in, of pulling those feet directly down into the floor and then leveraging those shoulders vertically up. The previous points, they are very important to mastering slack pull, but they're very important to mastering the deadlift in general. This point is vital for mastering slack pull in general. If we don't satisfy this requirement, we're going to have a lot of issues. And one of the big issues that a lot of people have is don't let yourself drop down as you wedge in. And a lot of things I mentioned prior, with maybe thoracic rounding or anything like that, that kind of leads to it a bit. But otherwise, there's some people who think too much. They don't maintain that upward tension as they leverage down on the floor. And what I mean by that is they get this really good tension, the bar slack pull, and then as they go to pull in, they dip back down and lose that. What we do want to do is keep those shoulders and that upper back position as high as possible at all times. We're trying, like I mentioned, one of the things that's probably understated with why we slack pull is we're trying to create a higher starting position, because that's going to be stronger. We're reducing range of motion. We're putting the joints in a more advantageous position for strength. We want to create the highest starting position as possible. So when we go to pull slack, I'm trying to get these, if I could pull my shoulders up to here, I would. I can't, because obviously the bar is still on the floor. But our goal is to try and create the highest starting position possible. So the shoulders need to start high, stay high as I pull in, and then deadlift. I always was trying to raise those up the entire time, and even more so as I went to pull in. I'm obviously, one, trying to leverage that bar up as I pull that slack out, but as I rotate, pull my feet into the floor, those knees bend, I'm trying to leverage those shoulders up even higher in that starting position, which is where you see someone like I mentioned, Garrett Fear. Bar already starts leaving the floor. They're constantly trying to rise those shoulders and upper back position up, and since extend the hips to create the highest starting position possible. Another element that's very vital to the slack pull, and it kind of goes along with the last point of letting yourself drop, is don't try and change your head position as you then anchor and pull in. That's where a lot of people get this wrong. So our head position may be different as we're setting up, because we're kind of wanting to see the bar a little bit. I don't want you looking forward as you go to grab the bar, because a lot of times that can run into issues as you can't even find the bar. So to get to the bar, we might be looking at it, but let's say my normal position is looking about 10 feet down in front of me on the conventional deadlift. As I go to pull that slack out, I want to be there. I don't want to be here, pull the slack out, and then as I go to pull, change my head position, because head position changes your thoracic position. And if you're doing that, that's going to then change your tensioning and distribution. And again, it goes back to an overriding factor. Once we get that slack in our hands, we don't want to manipulate anything other than our joint angles. We don't want to manipulate our spine angle. We don't want to manipulate our head position. We don't want to manipulate anterior, posterior tilt of the pelvis. Those should all be set. The only things we're changing are those foundational joint angles of the hip hinge, the knee flexion, and then the hip ER and abduction that I've already talked about. So what I mean by that is, if my head position is 10 feet down on the floor, and that's where I usually look on the conventional deadlift, when I go to pull the slack, I'm going to look there, then pull in. If my position on sumo is straight in front of me, it might be down at first. I'm getting in position. Okay. I'm going to look forward, hips rise, and then pull in. I made sure to set my hip position before I did those other things so that everything could lead with where that head position was leading me. And the last one is more of a don't, in the sense of probably 95% of the people watching this should not do this. It's a very advanced technique. We'll call it the Kaler-Woolen technique. You're literally trying to explode so hard in that wedging that the bar pops off the floor. You can see that on the deadlift record, supposedly, that he hit at the SPF record breakers, where it literally left the floor, went back to the floor, and then came back up because he tried to pop it so hard. Jamal Browner's talked about how he literally tries to kind of pop it into a block pull. That is a very advanced technique. That's why I'm not saying it's a don't, but I'm saying if you have not mastered slack pull, don't do that. We want to make sure that we are satisfying positional requirements before we then move into more advanced techniques. So what you should do is only wedge and anchor yourself as fast as you can maintain position. A big mistake people make is that they do all the things I said, great slack pull, and they go, and they try and pull in as fast as they can, and then all the things I said don't do happen. They start rounding, they drop, they kick the bar forward. We should only pull in as fast as we can maintain position, because while the pull in kind of gives us this kind of fake eccentric loading, it's not doing as much as most people think. That's why some people can deadlift a lot. Trevor Jaffe just deadlifted 800 doing the static pull position without having to do any type of slack pull, in the sense of like this anchoring and wedging, and kind of in a sense the eccentric loading portion. We are going to, in a sense, make this completely useless if we pull in too fast. We should be only pulling in fast as we can to get into the position. And as you get more experience, maybe that is faster. Maybe you can pull in faster and get a little bit more of this pop, but don't do that until everything else has been mastered. So what you should be doing, like I said, I suck at sumo deadlifting. I am not good at it. So I, even more so than conventional, go really slow if I sumo deadlift. So what that's going to look like, I'm going to tension up, and then as I pull in, very slow as I drive my knees out, I bring my chest up and I wedge into position. What I don't do is this. Because even right there, I already felt myself lose position. That was way too fast. My hips lowered too much. I rocked back onto my heels. I lost tension. You should only be pulling in as fast as you can maintain position. And I would say for the vast majority of people, especially watching this, if you don't master sumo, go slow. Really slow it down. Sumo and conventional. Really slow it down. Do not rush that setup, and you'll get way more out of being efficient with maintaining that slacking position than you'll ever get from trying to get this pop action off the floor. All right, if you made it this far, we went over the foundational principles of slack pull and kind of the things that need to proceed that all deadlifts really need to have. Went over the 5 best techniques, in my opinion, that we see most prominently with the best and most efficient conventional and sumo pullers when it comes to slack pull. Went over the do's and don'ts of things that for really any deadlift that really we need to make sure that we are perfecting and optimizing, but also some things that are very specific to being better at slack pulling. And then lastly, like I said, I want to go over some of my lifters that display the 5 techniques. So you can see this a little bit more in real time and in lifters who are training and seeing how they're applying this in their manner. Because like I said, even though those 5 techniques, I honed in on exactly what they were, we're going to see a lot of different variations of that. But like I said, I think if you go through any proficient deadlifter, you'll see kind of how their deadlift kind of fits into one of those specific styles. And that's what we're going to see here as we go through it. All right, so let's get into it. Let's start with kind of that RDL slack pull position. As I mentioned, you probably see this a bit more with conventional deadlifters, but I'm going to have 2 conventional deadlifters and 2 sumo pullers as examples. So first we'll start with Joel here. Ooh, a little bit too fast there. We don't want 2 times. Okay, so we see Joel. And that was a pause deadlift, but we can see kind of how it went. He got into this hinge position. He never really got fully into it. It's all kind of straight leg. He's tensioning from there. We can see here, slack was pulled out. Obviously, this is a stiff bar, so we're going to get less, but still very important. And then from there, he's going to go from that posterior tensioning to also loading those anterior muscles and then pulling from there. We can see how much slack he gets out. He obviously gets a little bit more as he pulls, which is pretty common. If he maybe get a little bit more slack out of that bar in the beginning, but he's going from that kind of like 30% to 100%, and then pauses and locks it out. Here we have Peyton. We'll see again, RDL into position. He grabs the bar. He's going to tension there. Oh, stopped and went through. He's going to tension and then pull. So in slow motion, we see that RDL pattern. He's going to tension up. You can see it's very slight. It's kind of a bang bang motion, but he tensions up first, right there, tension up, and you can literally see as he does that, you can see how that upper back and back in general tightens up, and then from there, he pulls in and deadlifts. So, looking at that same pattern with sumo, it's going to look a little bit different, mainly because we're not going to get as much of a stiff leg position on sumo. So here we've got Sean Noriega, and we're going to see kind of how he goes about it. So let's go full speed. Yep, I gotta watch that. Okay, got through it. So we're going to see here, he's kind of in that abducted, externally rotated position. Like I kind of mentioned, if someone could grab the bar from here, aka Yuri Belkin, that's awesome, but he can't. He's going to have to then manipulate joint angles. So he's going to go into a hinge as he grabs the bar. So I'm going to count that as kind of an RDL pattern because he never really, he doesn't ever kind of get into true sumo deadlift position there. He's going to get in that hinge pattern. You can see bar tensions up, pulls slack out, rotates around that fulcrum of the shoulders, knees open out, he gets into position, and then deadlifts. Here we have Zach, similar technique. That was deadlift him losing grip, but it was still a good example. So what we see on Zach's deadlift, we can see here, very much like Sean's. Let's pause it, freezing on me a little bit. He's kind of externally rotating a bit. He's probably actually going a little bit more into a RDL type position. And if there was a critique here, he kind of reaches for the bar, as you can see. You can see the hips go back as he reaches for the bar, but he probably could be a little bit more patient on that. But here he's kind of in that kind of stiff leg position. He's going to rise a little bit, but I still kind of call it the stiff leg because he never really got much into a sumo deadlifting position. He's going to rise. We see that tension taken out. He's keeping those shoulders high. He leverages in and then pulls. All right, so next up, we've got the kind of rise to slack pull position. So let's first go through Lorenzo here and we'll see what that looks like. Okay, so we see here, he's kind of in a sumo deadlift position. Like I said, this is where it's different, is that he's got more knee flexion. He's more of kind of in a position where he could maybe pull from. And then from here, he's obviously rising. In this particular video, one issue we've actually fixed with Lorenzo is he's tensioning a bit too much through that upper back, as you can see. Like this is where the tension's going, head is down. But still, we can see how much here he rises, how much slack he gets out. But again, like I said, probably an issue there is how much that upper back is having to thoracically flex to be able to get that position. And then while holding that bar position, you can see it never decreases once. He's always got that slack pulled. He rotates around that fulcrum of the shoulders, pulls in, and then deadlifts. So the thing we've really worked on is we've worked on pulling more through those upper traps and getting that head up to begin with and not pulling the head up as he pulls in. That's become a lot more efficient since then. So here we got Thean. Very similar setup. He's kind of in a sumo deadlift position. He's going to rise up to tension. We can see that slack pulled out. You can even see kind of like with someone with hook grip in particular, you can see how his hook starts to get more into the fingertips as he does that too. I mean, if someone's hook gripping, this is maybe, I want to say it's more important. It's always important to pull slack, but if you're hook gripping, you're going to get destroyed if you're not pulling slack correctly. And so there, he tensions up, the whole body rises. Like I said, we can see the shoulders and the hips rise together. And then he rotates, the knees come out a little bit. He's in the position, he holds that slack and actually probably gains a little bit as he pulls in. And then pulls from there. All right, next up is what I consider the deadlift position. Or actually, sorry, let's show conventional with the rise up first. So let's look at the rise up variation, the conventional as well. So we've got Rob here. So one thing Rob does do is he has a little bit of a pop, but that's also because he's gotten pretty proficient at this. But you can see here, he almost does the RDL variation, but the last second, he kind of dips down. He then rises up, and you can see again, like if we're looking right here, look how not just his hips rise, look at where this rises to pull that slack out. Everything rises, and he then pulls in. Like I said, he kind of does this little bit of a pop to get in position, and then locks through. So, and then we've got Peyton here. And we're going to have two good examples here. One, like I said, he's pretty much in a deadlift position. He's going to rise, and like I said, big key here, this rises too, not just the hips. We're going to see that back angle rise up towards the ceiling. It rises, and then he pulls in. His one issue that we kind of struggle with is he tends to dip those shoulders down. You can literally see, here's the shoulder position right there, and then look where he dips down to. We can see that lower. So that's always something we're trying to work on with Peyton. But again, good example of kind of this rise, pull the slack, and now if we can just keep that shoulder position high the whole time as he pulls in, he's going to be really solid with that. All right, next up, we've got the deadlift position to the rise to the slack pull. So we'll see this with Abby here. So what we can see here with Abby is she's getting in position. It's freezing a little bit on me. See if I can get it to unfreeze. Okay, there we go. She's getting into position. She's actually in her deadlift position right here, and you're going to see she tensions up on that bar. Tension's taken. Then as she could pull from here. This would be kind of the example of the static pull, but she's going to tension. Then her hips are going to rise up while she maintains that tension, and then she's going to pull down as she deadlifts. And so same thing with Matt here we're going to see. We're going to see him get in position. He could almost deadlift from here if he just kind of pulled that head and chest up a little bit more. But pretty much he's going to rise his whole body to get that slack out. Then the hips are going to come up. Then he's going to pull back in, get a little bit more slack out before then deadlifting. All right. For the static pull, I only have one lifter who really does that right now, and that's Joey. Even kind of doesn't even do it as much anymore, but he definitely did, and this is back before 2019 Nationals. So I included both videos here so we can kind of see two different views. So he was very successful with this. You can see he never really kind of has a pull in. He just kind of gets in the position, kind of slowly gets that slack out, and then lifts. So we'll see it here again. So what we can really see is, like I said, he gets in the position. The computer's wanting to be buggy with me today. Okay, so he kind of gets that slack tensioning out. Then he accelerates with the actual lift. The bar breaks the floor to lockout. That one's a little bit fuzzier. Let's see if we can get this one to work better. Okay, this one's probably a bit better. So you can already see he's kind of just, as he kind of is giving his little work to that bar, you can see how he's tensioning there. He's going to get the slack, and then he gets into his pull position from that static position, and then really from there increases that drive to the floor to lock out. So, and then the last here is the kind of rise and pull the slack as you pull in, and we'll see Al do that here. Okay, so you can kind of see with Al, there's not really much slack being pulled out of the bar at this point. His hips are up. He could have, like I said, we could think about that just general body position rising up a bit more, but he does a pretty good job with this. There's not really much slack out here, but as he goes to pull in, you can see he increases. If we're looking here, there's the height of his shoulders. He's increasing that height of his shoulders as he pulls in, and we see a good inch or two rising up, and that's where he gets the slack out. You can see as he pulls in, we really get a good deal of slack out, and then from there, boom, then he starts driving and goes through lockout. So that covers it. That's everything I've got in regards to slack pull, the 5 best techniques, the foundational principles, the do's and don'ts, and then really looking at lifters who have done a great job of mastering these techniques to be as efficient as possible at pulling slack out of the bar when they deadlift. So if you have any questions, always feel free to leave a comment below. Make sure if you're not subscribed, subscribe, hit that like button, share. Let's spread the knowledge. I make these videos for free and put out as much information as possible because I just want the powerlifting community to have this knowledge versus hiding it from everyone. So let's get it out there, share it with your friends. Let's make everyone the best deadlifters they can be. And if you have any also as well, if you have any certain videos you'd like to see in the future, comment below and I'll add them to my list and hopefully be able to cover some more topics that you guys really find relevant. So thank you guys, and I'll talk to you later.